Thank you for introduction. It does sound dramatic. We set it out as hooracán. It's more of a breeze so far, not exactly a hooracán, but I guess it's it's growing. It's growing. So it's we've been in business just over a year, and our focus is on this region, on Bulgaria, Romania, and Moldova. And when we looked at these countries, so we thought, what can we do in this region? Across the energy transition space, and we've selected a number of sectors. In Bulgaria and Romania, we are mostly active in offshore wind. A little bit of a fantasy today, but it's a long-term process, and we are in that process, on that journey. And in Moldova, we have a pipeline in development of onshore wind projects, about 200 megawatt. So it's an interesting market. I can cover it a little bit because I hear people are talking about Moldova here in relation to Romania. There is a lot of, I think, misconception about that particular market, and of course, it's very interdependent with Romania and with the rest of the region. Now, maybe talking a little bit about offshore wind. You would say, "Wow, are we crazy? Why are we looking at offshore wind already?" Here, Evangelos saying it doesn't make sense in Greece, and in Greece, offshore wind resource is more exciting than in Black Sea. So, I guess what your response will be to Black Sea too. But from our perspective, we've seen this movie before, right? In our regions, we know how offshore wind develops. In markets, in emerging markets, and we believe that there is potential for Black Sea today. If you look at offshore wind in Black Sea today, it's of course not competitive. You wouldn't go and do any project, finance any project today, because your LCOE, levelized cost of energy, will be north of 100 euro per megawatt hour. But what needs to be understood is these projects are very different to onshore renewables, and the timeline to develop them is much longer. When we talk about offshore wind, it typically takes, say, 8 to 10 years, and your final investment decision will be made 6 years from today if you start today. And what's really important to understand is direction of travel for the development of the sector, for the development of the technology. And what we think is happening in that sector, what is relevant to Black Sea is exactly that advancement in technology, especially floating foundations. Why it is important? Because Black Sea has very complicated bathymetry. It gets very deep quite quick, and even close to the shore, you have depth of say 40-60 meters. Which is today you can install fixed foundations, but they are expensive because you can't do monopiles. You have to install steel structured jacked foundations, which are expensive, and of course the price is driven very much by steel price, which is going up. Floating foundations will change dynamic in that sector quite substantially. We believe that by 2030, the cost of floating foundations will be lower than fixed foundations. So that's one driver, and then the second driver is the wind turbine technology themselves and efficiency of the wind turbines, which is increasing. And you can look at what has happened with onshore wind turbines when industry moved from Europe to places like India, to places like East Asia, where wind speeds are much lower. When manufacturers, they actually designed and produced different type of wind turbines, which is specifically tailored for low wind speeds. And you can have very high efficiency in low wind speeds market. And this is a similar dynamic which we will see in offshore wind. We haven't seen it yet because most of the development today is in the markets where you have relatively high wind speeds. But if you look at East Asia, for example, today in Japan and South Korea, which are very active markets for offshore wind, In those markets, wind speeds are very similar to what you have here in Romania and Bulgaria. So what we believe is going to happen is a technology which will be designed for those markets will eventually be also employed in this region. And one other important factor is the development of countries and perception of risk in these countries, which we hope will change within next several years. Because today, of course, if I'm talking to potential investors about offshore wind or even about onshore renewables, the expectation around returns is very high, and of course, if we factor that expectation into a model, then the output of it is a very high price of energy. So what we believe is going to happen is the expected rate of return for investors will come down for markets in Romania and in Bulgaria, and eventually they will be similar to what we now see in say Central Europe, like Czech Republic or Poland. So these markets will be perceived less risky than what they are today, and that will essentially bring cost of energy from offshore wind down, and we believe it will be competitive with renewables onshore by 2030. Also, another important dynamic onshore, which will be happening at the same time, is people will be running out of good sites. Right? Even today, if you look at both Bulgaria and Romania, you can see that the wind resource, the decent wind resource, is very much only in the eastern part of both countries, close to Black Sea, or in Romania also close to Moldova. First, there is very little grid capacity left in those regions, but even if grid is reinforced, eventually there will be no more land area available for those projects. And if you then look inland for wind, it doesn't look exciting at all, because the wind resource is very low. What it means, you have to go on a high elevation to get a better wind. And the problem with the high elevation is that about 30% of Romania and Bulgaria is designated as natural parks. And typically, if you looking at a hill, looking at a high elevation terrain, that's most likely will be an area under Natura 2000. So you can't really do anything there. What we've attempted to do in Bulgaria last year, and we parked it for now, is we've identified some sites which are inland, they're not in the eastern part of the country, where we can still get relatively good wind resource, but the land is municipal. Some of the land is designated as forest, even though there are no trees. And the problem with municipal land, of course, is that in order to get access to that land, you have to go through some sort of a tender or auction, so you cannot bilaterally sign a lease agreement. And before initiating the process, we went to potential investors, and we said, these are the projects, these are the economics, and these are the constraints, and investors didn't like it. Right, because one of the risks you have in Bulgaria is that in wind projects, right, specifically, often for you to convert land from, say, agricultural designation to the one suitable for construction, you have to go through a process which also includes CIA. Environmental impact assessment, and before you have that conversion of land, you cannot apply for grid connection, right? So the problem we then have is that there's a period of about 12 to 18 months until which you don't have any visibility on how likely you will be able to get grid connection. Of course, today you know what's available in the grid, but the problem is you can have a solar developer, you can have a battery storage developer who may start later than you and finish before you, right? So that's the risk, and then when we compounded that risk by the fact that you have to go through through that municipal land acquisition process and compounded by the risk of the market as well, it didn't sound particularly excited to investors who we are working with. So we parked it for now, but that's something still which we want to develop. So if there are any interested party, we can talk through the projects and what they are. But our focus today in this market is offshore wind. The challenge with offshore wind, of course, is it's highly challenge, and typically in our markets, it's what makes it easier that you have stakeholders on the federal level, on the government level. You don't need to talk to hundreds of individual landowners and so on. But what makes it different, what makes it challenging in this market, in this country, that the government keeps changing, right? And of course, it's very difficult to get people engaged in something which is long term, right? When they're themselves in the office for a few months, right? So it's been a challenge for us to get traction with the central government. So our approach and similar approach in Romania is go bottom up and go through the process of attempting to permit different types of activities related to offshore wind project. Through local authorities, through maritime authorities, and so on. And then when regulation catches up, when there is an offshore wind law, and there is maybe an auction for a tariff or for a seabed, then we will be there with substantially de-risked sites. Sites that we know can be permitted, sites that we've collected substantial information in terms of wind resource and so on. So that's the approach. That's the approach so far. We're quite optimistic that it will work. We have 3 sites, 3 areas which we've identified in Bulgaria. One site in Romania. Romania is a little bit more complicated because almost entire territory of territorial waters and exclusive economic zone in Romania is concessioned for oil and gas. And oil and gas is in Black Sea in Romania is more real than in Bulgaria, right? So there are active discoveries and new discoveries. So that's a real sector, and it's very important to have an understanding how a concessionaire for oil and gas block and a potential offshore wind developer will coexist. And for that, of course, you need the law, you need regulation, which is not in place today. So in Romania, the site that we've identified doesn't overlap with any concessions. In Bulgaria, I think we've got one site which overlaps with the concession, but that concession runs out in 2027. And it's been in place for more than 20 years. So our assumption is that if they haven't discovered anything in the past 20 years, presumably they won't discover any reserves in the next 3 years. So yeah, that's the approach. And then maybe a few words on Moldova. A lot of synergies with Romania. A lot of synergies with a wider region, including Bulgaria. There is a misconception about the market and about what say Bulgaria, Romania, Greece can do to decouple Moldova from Russian gas. The problem there is not the source, not the fuel, but infrastructure, right? The electricity generating infrastructure. And the issue in Moldova is that you've got several power plants, existing thermal power plants, 3 small, I mean, 40, 50 megawatt gas-fired power plants in mainland, let's call it mainland Moldova, not on the west side of Dniester. And then the main power generating facility is located in Transnistria, right, which was occupied since 1992. So a lot of people forget about it. But it's there. It's not under control of Moldovan government. It's owned by a Russian company, and it operates on the Russian gas, right? And you cannot, whatever you do with the gas, whatever you do with electricity supplies, you cannot get rid of this thing, because it's in the middle. That power plant is in the middle of physical infrastructure. All high voltage lines go from it to the rest of Moldova, and in terms of gas pipeline as well. So it's gas goes through that facility. So today, what you have is the Russians is essentially subsidizing the gas that they sell to Moldova Gas. Moldova Gas also is you can call it a Russian-owned company, right? Again, not many people know, but it's 50% owned by Gazprom. So that company buys the gas. It then sells the gas passes the gas to that power plant in Transnistria. The gas is subsidized, and the cost is about $200 per cubic meter. So it's 3 times lower, right? I guess I'm not sure what's today's price, but it's much lower than the market price. And on the output is electricity, which is priced at about 67 euro per megawatt hour. So that's output of that plant, right? And now the problem for Moldova is twofold. One is this price, which of course is much lower than what Moldova can procure from outside. They are buying energy from Romania today, but that energy is from nuclear generated power, but priced at 92 euros per megawatt hour. And this is driven by regulation, as far as I know, that you cannot, Romania wasn't allowed to export power at a lower cost to Moldova. And before the war in Ukraine, they also buying power from Ukraine, hydropower priced at north of 70 euros. So it's going to be a very difficult task, right, for that country to change its energy system. And my point here, I guess, what I'm trying to say, it's not just about supply, fuel supply, right? It's about the whole network, the grid itself. There needs to be a lot of interconnection built between Romania and Moldova as well for electricity to flow effectively. And maybe one last point is in terms of the energy markets in that particular country. So there is no energy market today. So there are some conversations about Moldova being part of Opcom, Romanian market. So that may be something which I guess is relevant to some of you. So I'll stop there.
Just before that, one question. It seems that you're very much focused on the offshore wind. I mean, probably you haven't built offshore wind until now, but you might in the future. What is the complementarity between the generation of offshore wind in the Black Sea area with the onshore wind and the solar? I mean, will that... Because what we were discussing earlier is how the variable generation of renewables will create gaps that will have to be filled with something, hydro, gas. Where will offshore wind fit into that? Do you have studies? Or to put it more simply, does the offshore wind in the Black Sea blows at the same time or different time than the onshore wind? Or the shining of the sun.
Yeah, so I think the characteristic of wind resource is very similar in Bulgaria and Romania to between offshore wind and onshore wind, because if you look at the wind map again, that's peculiarity of Black Sea is that most of the wind is actually close to the shore, right? So typically, if you look at any other region in the world, if you look at offshore, the farther offshore you go, the windier it gets. It's not the case in Black Sea. So it's the same wind which you have on both sides of the shore. The difference, of course, is that your efficiency capacity factor of offshore wind is higher, right? In Black Sea is not that high comparing to, say, Northern Europe. It's about 50%. But if you're looking at onshore wind, so that capacity factor will be below 40, right? In this region. So what is the complementarity? I think it's not. I guess it's not just something which is completely different, right? To say onshore wind, for example, is just an additional source of energy. Potentially, it's a more competitive source of energy as well. It will come at scale, right? So again, there may be a narrative around hydrogen. I think it's very stretched, but who knows how hydrogen sector will develop as well. Maybe there will be potential to look at installing facilities to transfer that offshore wind energy into hydrogen. It may be relevant in this region, right? As you know, in the east of Bulgaria, in Devnya, there is a very large cluster, agricultural fertilizer cluster. So, and green ammonia is maybe very relevant there. Now, if maybe another point here to add about scale, right? When you see a onshore wind project, say 100 megawatt onshore wind project, and we're talking about producing hydrogen, it often makes little sense, because the amount of hydrogen, the amount of green ammonia they can deliver out of that project is relatively small, and it will be hard to export it if there is no direct pipeline or direct connection from that location, which most likely will make this project uneconomical. So that's why if you have a power plant which is 1 gigawatt, 2 gigawatt, 3 gigawatt, it makes completely different sense. Yeah.